Welcome, weary traveler, to this video. This is a sort of continuation of my previous Nioh 2 video, in which I finally tackled the other two DLCs in more detail. This was originally a part of my first draft for the script of the first video, but I ended up cutting it off pretty early on, not only because it would make the video ridiculously long, which it ended up being anyway, oops, but also because I thought it would be better digestible as its own separate topic. The structure of this video is very simple. The first chapter covers the first DLC and the second covers the second one. I didn't include the third one since I covered it pretty thoroughly in my first Nioh 2 video. If you missed that one and are curious only about the DLC content, go to the fourth chapter of the aforementioned video. That's where I talk about the DLC. You may be a bit lost, but I can't force you to watch the entire thing, can I? But I would appreciate if you did watch the video in its entirety and maybe gave it a little like and comment so that the YouTube algorithm would realize that I have actually posted something. But I'm getting off topic. You came here for some game story analysis, not to listen to me cry about how annoying YouTube is. So then, let us do some analyzing, shall we? Once again, there will be spoilers for all the DLCs and the base game as well. Part 1. The Tengu's Disciple. As I have mentioned in my previous Nioh 2 video, all the DLCs take place in the past, and Hide visits and helps various wielders of Sohoyamaru, the yokai-slaying blade. In the case of the Tengu's Disciple, we jump back to the year 1185 to visit Minamoto no Yoshitsune. But before we get to him, allow me a few words about the historical context, since we are now in a different part of history. The main game takes place in the Sengoku era, but all the DLCs are set in the Heian period. If I could characterize this time in one word, it would probably be courtly. It is an era that was, for the most part, peaceful, hence the name, and thus the imperial court flourished. Culture was booming, especially poetry and literature, and with the influences from China waning, Japan was slowly forming its own cultural identity. There was also ample time for the favorite pastime of ambitious noble families, scheming whilst pretending not to. After all, you can't really have a flourishing imperial court without a dose of intrigue and some backstabbing, am I right? A proper Heian period aristocrat was not only skilled in politics, but also in poetry and music, and knew well which rules and rituals of day-to-day life to uphold so that success and luck was ensured. Because there was a belief that if one acts unwisely, for example going in a direction that was considered ill-omened that day, or making important decisions on a day that was not auspicious, one invites misfortune and calamity. Proper conduct was of the utmost importance, but even the talented Heian era noble couldn't possibly remember all the proper rules and rituals. Such a task fell to onmyoji, who were masters of many skills, divination of auspicious days, and recognition of bad omens included. I will talk about onmyoji in more detail in the second part of the video, since it's going to be more relevant then. So for now, just consider them to be a type of state official, whose services the aristocratic families of Heian Japan often employed. And while art was flourishing and poems were plentiful, not everything was well in the imperial court. Noble families slowly gained more and more power, especially the one named Fujiwara, which in turn meant decentralization and a slow erosion of the power of the emperor. The political maneuvering of the Fujiwara landed them the position of regent. At first, it was them ruling instead of a child emperor, but they later strengthened their regency, so they were always in charge, no matter the actual age of the emperor. Because the emperor was believed to be of divine nature, the Fujiwara family didn't dare to remove him entirely. Instead, they sought to influence him and siphon away his power and authority. But even their regency rule didn't last long, as the families who had military power rather than sway in the court began to be more and more prominent as the years marched on, and conflicts began to spring up once more. The Heian period is usually considered to end with the rise of the Minamoto clan to power. The year 1185 is when the Genpei War, a civil war between the Taira and the Minamoto clans, ended, and the Kamakura shogunate, established by Minamoto no Yoritomo, was born. The next historical period is thus called Kamakura, after the city where the shogunate was established and from where the shoguns ruled. But that's of no interest to us at the moment. The Heian period is a time when many a folktale takes place, and especially in modern pop culture, it is often characterized as a time of magic, when the lands were full of yokai and wonder. This is partially because to the people of the Heian period, all these yokai and kami were real, and the emperor's rule included them too. That's why there are legends such as that of Otakemaru or Shutendoji, where a brave hero slays the oni and brings their head to the emperor. The goal is to subdue the monster refusing to act in accordance with the emperor's wishes and his rule. Also, some historical periods seem to stir people's imagination more than others. Simple as that. But enough of general history. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, what's so special about him? Several things, of course, not least of which was his skill with the sword. What is relevant to Nioh too is that according to legend, Yoshitsune studied under the Tengu of Kurama Mountain, more specifically under their king, Sojobo. As is the case with many folk heroes, Minamoto no Yoshitsune was a real historical figure, a samurai of the Minamoto clan who lived in the late Heian period, from 1159 to 1189. He was a skilled fighter and military commander. It was his abilities that won the Minamoto clan the Genpei War and ensured their rise to the very top. Most of the historical records about Yoshitsune cover the various battles he fought in or commanded, which isn't all that important for the purpose of this video. If I were to recount all of that, it would just end as a list of years and places. A rather short list at that, because Yoshitsune died young, in 1189. He was betrayed essentially twice over, first by his brother Yoritomo. There was some back and forth between the two, but the quarrel was pretty much started by Yoritomo, who denied Yoshitsune land and titles he was awarded for his victory in the Genpei War, which forced Yoshitsune to flee the capital, and the second time by the Fujiwara clan, who Yoshitsune thought were his allies. Yoshitsune was thus forced to commit seppuku, and his head was presented to Yoritomo as a proof of his death. When we consider that Yoshitsune died tragically young and add to that his martial and military skills, it comes as no surprise that he is the subject of many folk tales. Some of them talk about his childhood adventures, and in those, Minamoto no Yoshitsune is referred to by his childhood nickname Ushiwakamaru. Ushiwakamaru is often portrayed as virtuous but naive, and already a skilled swordsman. There's a tale in which he defeats a bandit leader at only 15 years old. Such was Ushiwakamaru's prowess with a blade that many believed it to be of mysterious origin, taught to the boy by something inhuman. And so they would connect the prodigious child with a Tengu inhabiting Mount Kurama, whose fighting skills were said to be unparalleled. For all they didn't allow visitors to their mountain and disliked humans in general, surely an exception in the form of a curious child was possible? Tengu, written like this, are peculiar creatures from Japanese mythology. The two kanji literally mean divine dog, but there is nothing dog-like about Tengu. They are usually portrayed as having a mix of bird and human characteristics, depending on the specific kind of Tengu, of which there are several. The most important division would be into the hostile to humans, Kotengu, and isn't fond of humans but probably won't kill them on sight, Daitengu. Visually, Tengu look like birds of prey with human features, such as human eyes or noses, and wearing clothes, whereas Tengu are more humanoid, with wings and long red noses, often wearing the same apparel Yamabushi mountain ascetics would. Tengu live on mountaintops where they meditate, hone their martial and magical skills, and generally focus on self-improvement. How hostile they are to humans depends on the tale. They don't want to be disturbed, and if one wanders into the mountains they inhabit, one is either thrown out by magically summoned wind, Tengu often have fans with which they summon wind, or straight up cut down. It's honestly 50-50, so better not risk it. Despite the danger, many heroes would seek Tengu to learn from, and they are known to give aid to worthy humans, though the definition of worth seems to differ from Tengu to Tengu. In the case of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, he was indeed deemed worthy, and not just by any old regular Tengu, but by Sojobo himself. Sojobo is the most powerful of Tengu and is therefore often referred to as the King of Tengu. He resides on Mount Kurama and his skills in magic, martial weapons and military tactics are unparalleled. There would be no better teacher for Ushiwakamaru to learn from. And learn he does. Yoshitsune's prowess with the blade earned him the respect of many, including Benkei, whom Yoshitsune defeated and took as a retainer. This is one of the legends featuring Yoshitsune which is based on a real historical event. Saito Musashibo Benkei was a warrior monk whom Yoshitsune defeated in a duel, and Benkei came to serve under him until his death in 1189. Legends portray Minamoto no Yoshitsune as heroic and exceptionally skilled. But how about Nioh 2? The Yoshitsune of the game definitely has the fighting prowess. But let's start at the beginning. The DLC starts the same way as the others. Hide, accompanied by Nekomata and Hakutaku, finds a shrine with a bamboo flute and, thanks to the power of Sohayamaru, gets transported back in time, into the year 1185. We see a short cutscene which shows Minamoto no Yoshitsune fighting with Sohayamaru, and then we are thrown into the first mission. The DLC is set during the conflicts between the Minamoto and the Taira clans, and in true Nioh fashion, someone had the brilliant idea to gain strength through Amrita, because that never ever backfired ever, am I right? That someone in this case is the Taira clan, who were afraid of losing to the Minamotos, and as the result of their hoarding of Amrita, the entire coastline of Yashima is now full of yokai. Great. So Hide finds themselves on a shore, surrounded by numerous shipwrecks, and immediately gets attacked by yokai. Though considering the DLC takes place after the main story of the game, Hide hardly expects a warm welcome anymore. Several rounds of intense parkouring and falls into water later, Hide makes it out of the ship graveyard straight into the arms of Benkei, who immediately engages them in a fight. The warrior monk is a master of many weapons and uses them to make Hide's life significantly harder, but Hide eventually wins the fight, and both parties realize that there has been a misunderstanding. Hide is not allied with the Taira clan, and Benkei was just trying to fulfill his duty of protecting Yoshitsune. He saw Sohayamaru in Hide's hands and assumed the worst. Interestingly, Benkei is a yokai in the Nioh universe, a Seto Taisho, which is a yokai formed out of unused shards of pottery. It's a funny choice because Seto Taisho is a tiny yokai who often uses spoons and chopsticks in the place of swords and spears, but Benkei in-game, he's enormous and wields actual weapons. Seto Taisho is also considered to be an aggressive type of yokai who can reform itself upon shattering and likes to wage war with the kitchen staff. I guess that in the case of Benkei, the kitchen is the battlefield and the kitchen staff are the Taira soldiers. together with Benkei, who decided to act as Hide's guide. Now that he knows Hide's not a threat, Hide continues going further into the enemy territory, and the game trades bloodstained shores with shattered ships for grand wooden halls, which are nonetheless in total disrepair and full of yokai. However, the finale of the mission still takes place on a boat, because I guess we have to have at least one fight with a ginormous sea yokai per game. In the case of Nioh 2, Hide has to tackle an Uminyodo, which is really just an alternative name for Umibozu, but at least there are some visual differences between the two bosses, even if they are mostly just big blobs of seawater. Defeating Uminyodo and the hordes of crabs he summons rewards us with a cutscene in which Hide meets Yoshitsune and catches a glimpse into his mind and his past. We learn that Yoshitsune is a shiftling and that he grew up among the inhabitants of Mount Kurama and learned how to be a warrior from them. We also see that Benkei originally wanted Yoshitsune's sword, Sohoyamaru, but upon his defeat became a loyal servant instead, and that Yoshitsune's primary motivation in getting involved in the war between the two clans is the Amrita the Taira clan hoarded and started using. If there is no Amrita, there is no conflict, which is a sentiment we heard before. So let's see if Yoshitsune is going to have a bit more luck than Akechi Mitsuhide in the base game did. Yoshitsune also recognizes that Hide wields Sohoyamaru and asks for their help, and Hide of course agrees. Turns out that the Uminyodo Hide fought was the transformed leader of the Taira clan, and with him gone, the enemy forces are weakened, and so Yoshitsune decides to push on and crush any stragglers left, be they yokai or still human. But when he returns to the capital and proclaims his victory, he is accused of treachery and forced to flee east. But then he vanishes somewhere around Shuzon Temple, a grand monument built by the Fujiwara clan. This clan was neutral in the conflict between the Minamoto and the Taira clans, but in the story of Nioh 2, not only do they own gold mines, their gold is said to be eerie and glow, which means it's not gold at all but Amrita. It's therefore pretty obvious that Yoshitsune vanished in order to get rid of the Amrita, but Hide suspects something went wrong and goes to follow. The second mission of the DLC is thus all about finding Yoshitsune as fast as possible and getting rid of some yokai in the process. When we make it to him, Yoshitsune confirms that he was betrayed by the Fujiwaras, possibly because they didn't want to give up the Amrita they dug up, and that the whole place is overrun by yokai who were lured here by the aforementioned Amrita. Yoshitsune, well aware that he is vastly outnumbered, simply wants to leave. So he and Hide go to look for Benkei, who went ahead to scout the river which marks the border of Fujiwara lands. Unfortunately, we find Benkei surrounded by enemies, and he uses the last of his strength to protect Yoshitsune from arrows, which would surely be his death otherwise. Overcome by grief, Yoshitsune goes berserk and raises Sohoyamaru, which glows purple for a moment, suspicious, against not only the human enemies, but Hide as well. There's no other choice than to fight Yoshitsune and try to calm him down by essentially wearing him down. The math is simple. No energy equals no danger, right? This plan actually works, and Yoshitsune calms down, apologizing to Hide before giving them his flute. The same flute Hide saw in the temple at the very beginning of the DLC, before they traveled back in time. Yoshitsune then alludes to the presence of Otakemaru behind the scenes, though he does not name him, and symbolically entrusts Hide with Sohoyamaru as well as his own wishes of seeing the world be rid of Amrita. Hide then awakens back in the present, next to the shrine with the flute, their adventure across time successfully finished. The story of the first DLC is very simple, but it still showcases the subtle weaving of history with fiction Nioh is so good at. we covered two important events: Yoshitsune's victory over the Taira clan at Yashima and the betrayal he suffered at the hands of his allies, which led to his demise. And while I'm a bit sad we didn't spend more time with Yoshitsune, as far as the overarching story of Nioh 2 is concerned, this is more than enough. We get to see that the Sengoku era is not the first time someone thought that using Amrita is a good idea, and then everyone in the vicinity had to deal with the consequences. We also see that Hide is not the first hero fighting against yokai with Tsuhayamaru in hand. He's not even the first shiftling. There's a sense of tangible history Hide is now a part of, a lineage of extraordinary people bound not by blood, but duty and willingness to fight against evil. As for Yoshitsune himself, we see him at his greatest, victory over the Taira, and lowest, having to flee after he gets betrayed and also losing control after Benkei's death. And I don't think those two moments of his life were chosen at random. The first one shows us that great martial prowess and integrity means very little when one has to navigate the turbulent waters of the political scene. Power can be lost, and the favor of the current ruling forces is ever so fickle. As for the second moment, well, not only do we see that Yoshitsune's great victories didn't turn him into a prideful warlord, but we also see how dangerous could he be if he ever stopped caring about yokai and the human both. Even after he's overcome by grief at Benkei's death and flies into blind rage, he's still able to return back from the brink, albeit with Hide's help. One can choose not to dwell in one's anger forever after all, and Yoshitsune, possibly thanks to his tutelage under the Tengu of Mount Kurama, seems to know the importance of inner peace and balance, unlike someone else we could name. And speaking of Otakemaru, the game never explicitly says he is involved, but his presence is still felt. Yoshitsune was betrayed by his own clan, in real history by his brother. It's unclear whether it's the same case in Nioh 2. And since we know Otakemaru likes to possess people, it's not that far-fetched to assume he is responsible. After all, at this point in time, he is already dead. I mean in body, not so much in spirit. Also, Yoshitsune, you bitch, I saw you in that Nioh 3 trailer! How are you there? I need answers. Part 2. Darkness in the Capital. Now, it's time to take a closer look at Minamoto no Yorimitsu, or Raiko, who, as I mentioned in my first video, is a woman in the Nioh universe. Minamoto no Yorimitsu's story is tied to the legend of Shuten Doji, but since we already fought the drunken Oni in the base game, and Nioh 2 is good at not making the player repeat boss fights, not counting side missions, the focus of the second DLC is on Abe no Seimei and his rival Ashiya Doman. Those two and their issues require some additional context, so let's start with Abe no Seimei. He's the most famous onmyoji and one of the most famous characters from Japanese folklore in general. He was a real historical figure, living most likely from 921 to 1005. We know this because there are actual historical records about him, though they only cover the last 30 years of his life. But of course, the historical Seimei and the Seimei from folklore are two completely different beasts. He was an onmyoji of considerable skill. That much is true regardless of whether you look into history or folklore. I have previously described onmyoji simply as state officials, which is an extreme oversimplification, so I will now elaborate further, because I find them to be a fascinating topic of discussion. And because I have shown great restraint in my first Nioh 2 video, I get to talk about onmyodo now as a treat. The word onmyoji is usually translated as yin-yang master, and as the name implies, the basis of their craft was a detailed knowledge of the wuxing and the nature of yin-yang. Wuxing, called Gogyo in Japanese, is best translated as 5 phases and describes interactions between 5 specific elements: fire, water, wood, metal, and earth. The word element is a bit of a misnomer, though it was historically used a lot, since the Wuxing was seen as the Eastern equivalent of the 4 elements of Western traditions: water, fire, wind, earth. However, both these concepts are different, even if there is some overlap. That's why it's better to talk about phases when describing the Wuxing. Why? Well, are you familiar with the Chinese concept of qi? It can be described as a vital energy which is found in all living entities, be they human, gods, or plants. It flows through bodies via a system of pathways, meridians, and it's important that it remains balanced and undisturbed, because imbalance in one's qi or blockage in one's meridians might lead to illness or worse, death. That being said, qi is malleable, and if one possesses the necessary knowledge, it is possible to not only balance qi, but also to cultivate and improve it, which in turn improves one's health and body. Qi is often visualized as a vapor or gas, not only because the word literally means breath in Chinese, but because it shows that qi is constantly flowing and changing, and also that it permeates everything. Air is also not a part of the Wuxing, so it can be easily used as a descriptor for qi in its neutral state. The 5 phases of Wuxing describe 5 specific kinds of qi, 5 natures qi can have. Unlike the Western 4 elements, which are much more static and of more permanent nature, the 5 phases are fluid and transformative. They interact with each other in a variety of ways, these two being the most famous cycles, and are, to put it simply, temporary states of energy. Just as the 5 phases are kinds of qi, so is the yin-yang, though the concept itself is much more complex. There is also the issue of how yin-yang is understood in popular culture in the West, and by that I mean how it's often warped into a single binary, often using feminine and masculine to describe yin and yang respectively. Ugh. Let us rather imagine yin-yang as 2 opposing forces of equal strength. One of them is passive, yin, while the other is active, yang. They forever push at each other, neither of them winning, and this in turn makes the entire universe move. When yin and yang are in balance, things are optimal, but a surplus of one or the other means trouble. It's the same principle on micro level inside human body and macro level within the universe itself. However, the nature of yin-yang isn't as simple as that of a binary. While both forces may be opposites, they are also complementary and fluid. They interact, interconnect, and support each other, all the while they push and try to devour one another. As I said before, yin-yang can be understood as types of qi, which means one can transform into the other, and that too shows the complex relationship between the two forces. They are a unity of opposites, and only together they make the supreme ultimate, the oneness before duality, the state of undifferentiated and infinite potential, the Tai Chi. And I'm going to rein myself back in before we get any deeper into Chinese philosophy and cosmology. And let's be real, esoteric knowledge that I'm in no way, shape or form qualified to talk about. So let's get back on track. Both concepts of yin-yang and the wuxing existed in China since ancient times, especially in medicine. But then, in the 2nd century BC, a philosopher named Tung Chungxu smushed those two concepts together and then added them into Confucian ethical framework, and tada! The naturalist school of thought was born. Thanks to Tung Chungxu's endeavors, Confucius's Book of Changes became an important tool through which the nature of yin-yang was understood and interpreted. The Book of Changes was originally a divination manual. It detailed the use of yarrow stalks to obtain numerical values, which were then used to form a figure composed of 2 sets of 3 lines. Even number meant a broken line, das yin, and odd number meant a plain line, das yang. A figure composed of 3 lines is called a trigram, and one composed of 6 lines, aka 2 trigrams, is called a hexagram. On top of that, depending on the values of each line, its capacity to change from yin to yang and vice versa was also determined. The diviner would then consult the Book of Changes, which had portions dedicated to each hexagram, before finalizing the reading. Even before Tung Chungshu, the Book of Changes was used as a base for metaphysical speculations and understood more symbolically. Tung Chungshu simply built upon structures that were already there, and was loud enough while doing so his name got therefore written down in history. Though considering what time frame we are talking about and how little sources we have, nothing is for certain. So, how does all this Chinese philosophy relate to the Onmyoji? Well, many of the thinkers and philosophers like to travel, and so the naturalist school of thought eventually found its way into Japan. There, it mixed with native beliefs and practices such as the worship of kami or the concept of kegare, as well as Buddhism later on, and turned into something wholly unique. However, trying to date all these events is where we run into trouble. The first usage of the word Onmyoji dates back to the 7th century, and it was firmly linked to the Bureau of Yin and Yang, Onmyoryo, established during the reign of Emperor Tenmu. In other words, Onmyoji was someone who was part of the Onmyoryo and practiced Onmyodo, yin-yang divination, which had roots in the Chinese naturalist school of thought, but was at the time most likely already remixed into something uniquely Japanese. However, this was not the first time an emperor has shown interest in non-native divinatory practices, so even the 7th century is at most a vague assumption. What we can say with much more certainty is that the golden age of Onmyoji were the Nara and the Heian periods. With all this additional context in mind, we can now at least partially answer the question, who were the Onmyoji? They were essentially government employees, but over the course of the Heian period, many rich and influential nobles came to rely on their services. You can imagine them as a guild of specialists that had to do certain things for the government, but who could also be hired by other people. Onmyoji had the ability to see the unseen, for example yokai, and discern ke, strange omens, read the stars, and divine not only the future, but also many things still in the present. Divination was used, for example, to locate lost items. Onmyoji were also in charge of specific rituals, many of which were annual, and they also did a lot of purifying, be it of objects, places, or people. They would also pacify vengeful spirits or raging yokai, so they are sometimes likened to exorcists, but such a comparison is woefully inadequate. Thankfully, this is mostly the case with older Western literature and papers concerning this topic. And speaking of incorrect comparisons, Onmyoji weren't priests and Onmyodo wasn't a religion. This was once a very popular hypothesis, among Western scholars especially, but it has been since disproven. I'd like to think that completely, but I know better than to expect miracles in the field of study that is religious traditions. Anyway, the two of the most famous Onmyoji clans were the Abe and the Kamo, whose main tasks were astrology and calendar making respectively. Such knowledge was, of course, jealously guarded, and that had consequences later down the line. When in the 16th century the Kamo clan died out, a lot of the calendar making knowledge was forever lost with them. But that's hardly important for this video. Of course, there was a certain aura of mystery surrounding Onmyoji, and folklore reflects and sometimes multiplies that. In some stories, Onmyoji come across as wizards more than anything else. And nobody was more powerful and more mysterious than Abe no Seimei himself. There's a myriad of stories that feature him, ranging from Seimei giving advice to nobles that later helps them solve a problem, to Seimei performing incredible feats of magic. In folktales, Seimei is a half yokai. His mother is a white kitsune named Kuzunoha, and Seimei inherited special abilities from her. For example, he could talk to animals or see the unseen basically from birth, whereas any other onmyoji had to gain this ability through diligent study of yin-yang. He also had much more power than his peers in general. His divinations were precise, his ability to read signs unmatched, and his skill with Shikigami was spectacular. And I am not going to derail this video further by talking about Shikigami, because that would be a topic in itself, so let's just consider them to be creatures that onmyoji could control and use, okay? Despite the later embellishments, we can say for sure that Abe no Seimei did exist. We have historical documents to prove that. When it comes to his supposed rival Ashiya Doman, however, the picture is significantly murkier. There are some records of an onmyoji named Doman from Harima, where Ashiya Doman was supposedly from, who was possibly a commoner onmyoji and who maybe had a quarrel with Abe no Seimei, but that's about it. We have no records of his date of birth or death or information about his family. Even his link to Harima is uncertain. Harima was a region that was regarded as undeveloped, therefore any onmyoji hailing from there would be considered a commoner. This was of course a pejorative, implying that the onmyoji in question was less knowledgeable than an onmyoji from the capital, because certain knowledge was available only to those sanctioned by the Bureau of Yin-Yang. On the other hand, lesser involvement with the Bureau could mean greater willingness to cast curses, which was at times discouraged or outright forbidden to onmyoji from the capital. As for Ashiya Doman, well, it's not clear whether he was from Harima originally and therefore a commoner onmyoji, or if he was one from the capital who was simply banished for his misdeeds. Since we know very little about him and even less about his youth, there's really no point in trying to ask that many questions. Putting his dubious origins aside, what do folktales tell us about Ashiya Doman, the bitter rival of Abe no Seimei? He's older than Seimei for one, that's a consistent characteristic of his. He's also prideful, boasting about his powers and skills and thinks himself the unmatched master onmyoji. That is, of course, where his rivalry with Seimei stems from. No matter the tale, Abe no Seimei's skills are always superior to Doman's. Seimei is also a much nicer person, willing to help other people, whereas Doman only cares for himself. He is also more than willing to employ trickery to win. He would cheat, curse, and murder without feeling any remorse. There's a famous story of a contest between Doman and Seimei, which involves a box of oranges. There is more to the story than this, but this best shows Doman's trickery. Doman and Seimei are asked to divine the contents of a box, and Doman, who previously bribed a servant to put 15 oranges in the box, confidently says there are 15 oranges, but Seimei contradicts him, saying there are 15 rats. Everyone thinks Seimei lost, but when they open the box, 15 rats jump out. Seimei not only correctly divined the contents of the box, he also punished Doman for his trickery by transforming the oranges into rats. Many of the stories featuring Seimei and Doman are of similar nature to this one. Before we move on to the DLC proper, let me just quickly mention that both Abe no Seimei and Ashiya Doman are associated with two specific symbols. A 5-pointed star, often in a circle for Seimei. This is a reference to the Wushin and Seimei's mastery of Onmyodo in general, and it also served as his personal seal. And a lattice consisting of 4 vertical and 5 horizontal lines for Doman. As for the third important figure of the DLC, Minamoto no Raiko or Yorimitsu, there is, paradoxically, not that much to say. As was the case with Yoshitsune, Minamoto no Raiko is also a real historical figure, living in the Heian period from 948 to 1021. His service to the state was military in nature, and since there wasn't any major historical conflict going on during his lifetime, he probably did a lot of bandit quelling. Just like Yoshitsune, Raiko too features in several legends, the most famous one being that of Shutendoji, where he slays the infamous Oni and is in general a beloved folkloric hero. In stories, he is courageous and noble, but also cunning and vindictive. He fights monsters, he fights men, he saves hapless villagers and rescues beautiful maidens. He is a perfect representation of a hero who comes from nobility and protects his land from evil while dressed impeccably, and is rewarded for his bravery and loyalty. Now that we know a little bit more about both Seimei and Doman and Raiko, we can finally take a closer look at the second DLC for Nioh 2. Starting with the name, because unlike with the first DLC, where the name was self-explanatory, Tengu's disciple Minamoto no Yoshitsune was taught by a Tengu, darkness in the capital is a bit more abstract. So then, why is the DLC called Darkness in the Capital? The story takes place in Kyoto, called Heian-kyo, which was the capital at the time, though the situation quickly goes straight to hell, literally, as the second part of the DLC allows us to experience the beauty of Yomi. Yomi is the land of death in Japanese mythology and is not an equivalent to hell, even if I use the word to make the joke. A more suitable translation would perhaps be netherworld or even underworld, as Yomi is said to be located beneath the ground. Yomi is also associated with Izanami, a creator goddess in Japanese mythology, who together with Izanagi created Japan and many of the deities residing therein. But the creation of new life is no easy task, even for a goddess. And, according to Kojiki, Izanami gets burned so badly while giving birth to a deity of fire that she has to leave the world of the living and go to Yomi. We can say she invented death, as she was the first living being to die. Don't worry though, Nioh 2 doesn't force you to fight Izanami, just her children, the lightning gods of Yomi. So you should still worry actually. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Darkness in the capital can thus refer to a metaphorical darkness, aka Ashia Doman being up to no good, or a more literal one, the entrance to Yomi, which was opened in the capital of Heian-kyo. With all that out of the way, it's finally time to talk about what actually happens in the DLC and what shenanigans await poor Hide this time. Once again, Hide is propelled backwards through time after they find an old shrine, this time with a small black box in it. When they reach out to touch it, we see that it has a golden pentagram engraved on top. And once Hide opens it, Sohayamaru starts glowing, and backwards in time we go. We are then shown a cutscene of Minamoto no Raiko holding the same box. When she opens it, a yokai looking like Mezuki but with blue eyes springs from it and starts fighting enemies, helping Raiko. That, together with the pentagram on the top of the black box, tells us that this time we will be dealing more with battles fought with spells rather than with swords, as was the case in Tengu's disciple. The DLC takes place in the year 976, during the reign of Emperor Enyu. Not that he's an important figure, seeing as at this point in history, the Fujiwara clan had already seized a lot of power by marrying into the imperial line, and they were the real decision makers when it came to the matters of the state. But neither the emperor nor the Fujiwaras really factor into the story, so we don't need to dwell on the historical background for too long. Hide finds themselves in the capital of Heian-kyo, but everything is on fire, and there are yokai on the loose. Something is clearly wrong. I hope you missed the flaming wheels, cause you're gonna be seeing a lot of them. As well as yokai pretending to be carriages. And crabs. Welcome to hell! Hide hastily makes their way through the burning capital, and in no time at all they come across Minamoto no Raiko, who mistakes them for a full-blooded yokai and thus an enemy, and attacks them. The ensuing fight shows her prowess with Onmyo magic. She keeps summoning various yokai to help with the fight, while relentlessly attacking Hide with Sohayamaru. She also makes use of her guardian spirit. Of course, she is a legendary hero, and will use all tools in her arsenal to make sure the city is either safe again or at least avenged. This miniature clash of titans is stopped by the sudden arrival of Sakata no Kintoki, who tells Raiko that she's needed by the main gate. Raiko then stops the fight and promises to finish Hide off later. Even though she saw them wield Sohayamaru, her own hatred of yokai makes her unable to consider them anything other than an enemy. There are two things of note in this cutscene. First, Minamoto no Raiko calls herself a yokai slayer and appears to bear a significant hatred for all yokai and their kin, which directly contrasts with Yoshitsune, who didn't even blink when Sohayamaru lit up in Hide's presence, welcoming an ally regardless of their heritage. He also didn't call himself a yokai slayer. Why would he? When he grew up among them and is part one himself, he just said that Sohayamaru is a treasured sword of his clan, the Minamoto clan, whereas Raiko puts emphasis on it being a yokai slaying sword. She clearly considers all yokai to be evil, and it's not that hard to understand her stance. She is a human woman who fought against yokai before. The DLC presumably takes place after she has already slain Shuten Doji, and if she never saw any yokai acting to the contrary, what other conclusion could she possibly have drawn? And when she saw Hide, they had horns, so in her head the math was simple. The second thing of note is the presence of Sakata no Kintoki, and by that I mean I'm glad he's included. It would be easy to focus solely on Raiko and leave her heroic companions out of the story completely. While it was indeed Minamoto no Raiko who has slain Shuten Doji, he did not make the journey to the Oni's fortress on his own. He was accompanied by 4 warriors, no less courageous than he was, called the Shitennou, the 4 heavenly kings. Those were Watanabe no Tsuna, Sakata no Kintoki, Usui no Sadamitsu, and Urabe no Suetake. Each of them has a few legends attached to their name, which are not really important for this video. Aside maybe for Kintoki, who had been raised in the mountains by an old yokai lady, but I don't think the game ever makes note of that, since he's a side character, so I'm not going to go into any detail either. Moving on! The second story mission of the DLC continues where the first one left off, and Hide follows Raiko to see what's going on, and maybe also to show her that they are not an evil yokai. No, that's their uncle actually, they are on Raiko's side. Rashomon, the main gate as I called it earlier, because the road to the very center of the capital went through it, and also because it was a key strategic location, is on fire. And there are also yokai absolutely everywhere, so things are about to get toasty. Hopefully you packed some water talismans. The boss waiting at the end of the second mission is Tsuchigumo, a yokai who is part man and part spider. No, not like that. There is a legend tied to Minamoto no Raiko in which he heroically defeats a Tsuchigumo, so this is a very fitting choice for a boss fight. I said that Tsuchigumo is a yokai who is part human, part spider, but that is not always the case. Its appearance varies from story to story, and it progressively got more bizarre as time went on. It was sometimes a giant spider with a human face, or a few human features, such as a nose and eyes but with a monstrous maw. Sometimes a tall humanoid, but with spider legs protruding from its torso, and other times it was just a giant spider that could transform into human to lure its prey into its lair. Nioh 2 chose the humanoid with spider features approach, and the Tsuchigumo of the game looks like this. When Hide steps into its lair at the Rashomon gate, the Tsuchigumo is already engaged in a fight with Minamoto no Raiko and Sakata no Kintoki. Both warriors show remarkable strength and fighting ability, but the Tsuchigumo still overcomes them. It traps Kintoki in a web and then does the same to Raiko moments later, once she gets distracted by Kintoki's distress. It's up to Hide then to slay the yokai and hopefully get into Raiko's good books by doing so. Destroying the Tsuchigumo does not solve the situation the city is in, however, as the true culprit reveals himself, Ashiadomon. Raiko immediately tries to attack him with her summons, but he turns them against her, calling her foolish, before leaving. Raiko and Hide then get saved by Abe no Seimei, who destroys the summons, which Raiko isn't very happy about. Apparently those summons were a prized collection of hers. Seimei then briefly shows us how the current situation, aka the city being on fire, came to be, though he is rather vague. And let's be honest, half of his speech is a thinly veiled insult of Raiko's brashness. Despite Seimei's mischievousness, he and Raiko are obviously friends or at least allies, and their bickering helps to ease any lingering tensions. Raiko also seems to have reconsidered her attitude towards Hide and is now willing to ally with them against Doman, who is, according to Seimei, behind the misfortune that has befallen the capital. Speaking of Seimei, the game presents him as a young man, dressed elegantly in a more or less historically accurate onmyoji garb. Yes, the funny head was a thing that people wore back then. His hair is long and flowing, indicating he is a free-spirited individual, and we also see that he enjoys a little bit of mischief here and there. Must be the kitsune genes in him. Doman, in comparison, is much more haggard-looking, wearing tattered robes in various shades of grey. Where have we seen that before? He is also barefooted and visibly older than Seimei, and when he uses a spell, his symbol, the lattice, appears briefly, shining an ominous red. We have learned in the base game that red indicates trouble, or straight up the influence of Otakemaru, which is alluded to here as well, since Seimei mentions Doman disappeared for a while, and that he may had, in his arrogance, messed with powers far beyond his comprehension. Translation: Doman probably came across the angry spirit of Otakemaru, and then things went sideways for the arrogant onmyoji. Whatever evil scheme Doman's cooking in the background is unclear at this point, but he did open the gate to Yomi in the middle of the imperial palace, and you gotta give it to the man, that is a very poetic placement. The entire palace is also full of yokai and amrita growing from the ground and walls in giant chunks, which, is bad. Aside from the yokai, there are also onmyoji allied with Doman either willingly or unwillingly in the palace, so traversing the inner court grounds is tricky. Hide manages, of course they always do, but there may have been a few turnarounds and close run-ups with crabs involved this time. We find Doman at the entrance to Yomi. He comes out of the same portal Otakemaru uses, that's another visual link, and scolds Hide for being opposed to him even though they have yokai blood. This time the cutscene shows us Doman from a much closer angle, and we can see that he is blind in one eye and that half of his face is either messed up or maybe stained with ink. It definitely has strange texture. Before Hide can do anything, much less attack, Doman unleashes what are most likely tormented spirits and then vanishes again. And Hide has to deal with Berserk Nekomata, who once again thought he could deal with all the spirits and once again miscalculated terribly. The cat just never learns, does he? This time at least we have the legendary Abe no Seimei with us, and he purifies poor Nekomata after Hide subdues him, because it's hard to cast spells when you're getting attacked by a giant angry cat monster. Since Doman teleported away, there is no choice but to follow and descend to the depths of Yomi, which Nioh 2 portrays as an enormous cavern system, full of bones, weird growths, and puddles of blood. Delightful place, truly. No wonder Izanagi sealed it off with a giant boulder. For this part of the mission, both Seimei and Raiko join Hide, and together they cross the treacherous plains of Yomi, fighting off various denizens of the netherworld, including the hags which serve Izanami herself that try to hinder their progress. But hey, nothing a half yokai, a legendary hero, and a legendary onmyoji who is also half yokai can't handle, right? Nevertheless, Hide ends up having to confront Doman on their own, because just as the group finally makes it to his hiding place, Seimei gets a message from his Shikigami that a horde of monsters appeared in Byodo Inn, and he and Raiko have to hurry to deal with the situation. Which may be a good thing, since Doman, upon seeing that it's only Hide who came to fight him, addresses them directly and confirms our suspicion about Otakemaru's presence within him. He immediately recognizes Sohoyamaru and also accuses Hide of standing in his way before, which most likely refers to the fact that Hide is the one to stop him in the third DLC. Hey, spoilers! The players haven't made it to the last DLC yet. Since the cutscene shows us Ashia Doman up close, we can see that he also has his lattice painted on the right side of his chest with blood. Oof. He also wastes no time in attacking Hide, using a lot of lightning-based attacks, which, hahaha, foreshadowing. Did you really think the final boss of the DLC is going to be a disgraced Onmyoji with an attitude problem? Think again. Upon his defeat, Doman pulls one last trick out of his sleeve. Using his own body, he summons the 8 lightning gods of Yomi, and the true fight begins in earnest. If you thought Doman was using a lot of lightning during his fight, you'll soon realize he had nothing on the 8 lightning gods of Yomi. I mean, the name says it all. Nioh 2 still decided to be a merciful game though, and you only fight one enemy, so that's nice. What is not nice is the amount of lightning you have to deal with. Excuse me, this stuff hurts. Once the lightning gods of Yomi are slain, we see Doman's body unceremoniously hit the ground, presumably dead, and Otakemaru's specter rises from it, simply stating that he cannot be destroyed before vanishing through a portal. The scene then shifts, and we see Seimei and Raiko in Byodo Inn, preparing to seal away Shutendoji and Tamamo no Mae. Seimei leaves Sohoyamaru with his Shikigami, which he instructs to watch over the world in his stead, and then he and Raiko proceed to seal the 2 great evils using their own bodies. Hide arrives then, and Seimei has enough strength to acknowledge their defeat of Doman, and Raiko's last words to Hide are similar to Yoshitsune's. She symbolically passes the duty of protecting the world from evil to them. There is also the added symbolism of Hide being the one who eventually seals Otakemaru, so she is also telling him to get the 3rd great evil. We then get to see a bit of Raiko's past, which explains that she hates yokai because they killed her clan, and then she of course gives the player a hint as to what the next DLC is going to be about. And so Hide returns back to the present and puts the black box, now devoid of any magic, back to the shrine, before quietly leaving the past in the past, where it belongs. Now that we have looked at both DLCs in detail, it's time for some concluding thoughts. Whereas the 3rd DLC is directly linked to the main story of Nioh 2, since it deals with Otakemaru's past, both Tengu's disciple and Darkness in the Capital are tied much more loosely through Sohoyamaru, the yokai-slaying blade, and the vague presence of Kashinkoji, the shade of Otakemaru's rage and hatred. Suzuka Gozen mentions in the base game that Otakemaru is behind much of the strife Japan found itself in up to that point. Both DLCs thus serve as a glimpse into the past, 2 moments in time where Otakemaru directly or indirectly influenced historical events. He was clearly messing with people's minds even before the Sengoku chaos unfurled. In the first DLC, we saw his shade lurking behind the figure of Yoshitsune's brother, and in the second one, we saw him leave Doman's body after the lightning gods of Yomi were defeated. We know that Otakemaru is trying to regain his lost strength through Amrita, and then probably simply get rid of all humans, since his rage and hatred is eternal and all that, though a lot of said hatred seems to be directed at the wielders of Sohoyamaru in particular. And that makes perfect sense. Sohoyamaru is the sword that had slain him and then continued to cause trouble for him and his plan. It is also a reminder of Suzuka's refusal to join him and of Suzuka in general, since the sword came directly from her. In Otakemaru's eyes, Sohoyamaru is the only true threat to him, the blade and the shiftling who wields it. Because while for Hide and the player, the sequence of events goes in accordance with the DLCs, as in, we go further and further into the past to discover how it all started, for Otakemaru it's the opposite. He was defeated by a shiftling with Sohoyamaru, and then the sword constantly kept popping back up, so Otakemaru started taking preventative measures. Raiko mentions her clan was killed by yokai, and since they were the keepers of Sohoyamaru, it's likely Otakemaru tried to prevent any possible hero from claiming the sword. At the same time, however, it doesn't seem like Otakemaru considered Raiko to be that much of a threat to him personally, since she was human. His chaos sowing endeavors weren't targeted on her specifically, they were more general, let us say. In comparison to that, Yoshitsune was a more personal target, since he not only wielded Sohoyamaru, but was a shiftling too. He probably set off every alarm bell in Otakemaru's head. After all, by the end of the first DLC, Yoshitsune is being actively hunted despite his victory against the Taira clan, and so my reading of the story is as follows. Yoshitsune grows up on the Kurama mountain, so Otakemaru, who is keeping an eye out for possible heroic figures with magic swords, doesn't know about him just yet. Then he proves his existence and skill in the war against Taira, which Otakemaru most likely started in order to get some Amrita, already wielding Sohoyamaru. He probably gained the right to the sword sometime before the war, and Otakemaru sees him, goes, "Oh shit," and then decides to get rid of him straight away, just in case. I don't think Otakemaru really cares that Sohoyamaru is wielded by different people throughout the ages. He just sees the sword and remembers Hide killing him in the third DLC, aka the first time Otakemaru encountered them. Time travel, am I right? And so he tries to get rid of both the sword and its wielder, only for the sword to pop up again sometime later in the hands of another person? Outrageous. And that, for me at least, is the point of the DLCs. To show us that Hide wasn't the only one to struggle against evil and achieve victory. There is a whole lineage of heroes connected not by blood, but by the yokai-slaying sword they all wielded, which was, like a burning torch, passed down from one person to another, from generation to generation. The willingness to fight against darkness was there before Hide, and it's going to be there after them too. We already saw that in Nioh 1 with William, who can also be counted as a part of this heroic lineage, even though he had no chance to wield the magic sword, since Hide was hogging it for themselves at the time. But who knows, maybe the next hero will get the chance to see the legendary sword that slays evil yokai from up close. And that's it for this video. I hope you liked it, and you can go watch my first video on Nioh 2 here if you haven't yet. You can also give this video a like or a comment, unless you fell asleep in the middle of listening to me ramble about Japanese history. My next video will hopefully be a little shorter, though I thought that about this one too, and look how it turned out. Anyway, as always, you can find me on social media under the same name, and until next time, safe journeys!